We're going to start off with Bret Hart because he was interviewed by Abraham Josephine Reisman, who she was the author of the McMahon book that came out last year, Ringmaster. Bret was interviewed for that book and then did a follow-up here, getting Bret's reaction to all the allegations against the allegations against Vince McMahon. And it seemed to be a real kind of introspective look by Bret Hart into this facade that he held Vince McMahon up to and has kind of reached his end point when it comes to Vince McMahon. In the piece, which you can, there's a link to it on the site, but you can read it here up on Slate. I always had a respect for him. Now it's tainted. I'm embarrassed that I thought so highly of him. And went on to state that he clarified looking at the text that sounds like Vince McMahon when he was reading the text. And I'm sure this is someone that has exchanged many texts with Vince McMahon in history, and stating that he doesn't even think he'd be able to shake this man's hand if it was offered by Vince McMahon, if he was in such a situation again. What I thought was maybe the most telling is that he deeply regrets how dismissive he was of Rita Chatterton when she made the rape allegations in 1992. And I had recalled that Bret Hart had said, in my mind, he had been very dismissive of them. And I listened to some of the comments today. They are awful, awful comments that Bret Hart said about her. I'm really glad that he has come to a position where he deeply regrets what he said, because they're awful comments. And stated that he saw her recently at a convention and went up to her and apologized to her and no longer doubts those claims as well. So, I mean, it really got me thinking of, Bret Hart is one of them, and maybe he's an extreme example, but I think there's a lot of these performers that held Vince McMahon to this level of almost like this. Bret has said as much, this was a father figure to him. It's why his exit from the WWF in the 90s was so difficult, was because, he felt that he had this bond with Vince McMahon. And you go along the timeline of so many events that occurred at the hands of Vince McMahon that should not have afforded him such a reverence by a Bret Hart. And you go back to Stampede Wrestling. This is right when Bret has come into the company, and Vince brokers a deal with Stu Hart where for the next 10 years, he is going to pay him in installments equaling $1 million. And he gives the one payment at the beginning. And the next year, he just reneges on the deal, says, we're not going to continue the payments. You can open up Stampede again. Now, one of the reasons he gave was that there was a no compete because of this, and that Bruce Hart had been involved with some other people, may or may not have been involved with some attempt at an upstart. But this had nothing to do with Stu. It was a real loose, something very, very, intangible that Vince was holding on to. But pretty much screws Stu out of this $1 million that he is supposed to be getting over the next decade. And here is Stu. I mean, my son is working there. My Jim Neidhart is there. His future, employment. His family is so based around this. There's nothing he can do about this. You continue on through the periods of course, there is little stuff that Bret has brought up. The fact that he was promised this lengthy title reign and it's yanked out from under him with the Hogan stuff. But he is told at the time, and he just keeps up these the times that Vince broke his word to him. Of course, there is the fallout in Montreal and going against Bret's contract. So this would be the second time a contract with a Hart family member is reneged on. Kind of the third, because he signs a 20-year deal and 1 year in says, I can't afford you anymore. Maybe you should go to WCW. And then at the end of that, doesn't honor the reasonable creative control in the contract. Owen Hart occurs. I mean, and, Bret knows that case. And I understand a lot of it can get very in the weeds with the details. But if you want to go at the core of that stunt, when Owen Hart did one of the stunts in 98, he rappelled from the rafters on an edition of Sunday Night Heat. And what they had was this thing called a metal carabiner. And that is where you come down. This is what Sting would use, and you would unhook yourself. And this was like the safety or the safest way to do it. And Vince McMahon had a problem with how long that took, that there was this several second delay of unhooking yourself. And that led to his demand for this quick release snap shackle that they ended up using with Owen Hart. And they had an experienced rigger who was very concerned about this and did not want it to be used. They went with another rigger, and that goes down. I mean, you have Bret that has said so many times about if he had still been in the company, he believes his brother would have been alive. He would have never stood there as his brother attempts this stunt. And you have, Vince McMahon, the way he sued Martha. It was this ugly, ugly period. His family is just falling apart at the seams in front of the public eye. And then through all this, he's going to put together Bret, the Bret Hart story. He's going to put out a whole hit piece on Bret the Hitman Hart, which ends up coaxing Bret into working with them, because I think at its core, he wanted to have a proper anthology on his career, but did not want this hit piece. But he does go in and he gets to see the raw interview footage of all these like contemporaries of his, like just burying Bret. And he has to see all of this and works with the company, ends up coming back and doing an angle with the company, doing Montreal. I'm sure that Bret had his friction, had his problems. But when you look at that relationship, at the end of it, it was Bret that still held this guy at a certain level. And I would be amazed at like the amount of people that have just accepted some of these business practices and some just absolute personal hits on a person. And Bret Hart represents someone that, I mean, seemed to have given this guy an exceedingly lengthy amount of rope that I don't know how many would be able to, when you put it all together and you add it all up, of this very troubled relationship that the two had. And I don't know, maybe, and for all we knew, maybe this has been, Bret has had a very difficult rationalization of Vince McMahon all these years, and this is just sort of the final nail in the coffin. But that's what it felt like reading this.
It's probably incredibly difficult for us, as outsiders, to have any sort of like I don't know, definitive opinion about a complex relationship and history that these two share. All we can really comment on are events that we are privy to, but
we have quite a lot of public events that we can look at here. I mean,
sure, but there's still a lot we don't know about, just like mentally what either of them, has gone through while living, those stories. All we can really say is, knowing what has happened between these two, how would we react in the same situation? And a lot of, like, just even one of those things you might have mentioned, Montreal or Owen, like one of those things alone would have been enough to completely ruin a relationship. But it's, and if Vince McMahon didn't hold the keys to the entire wrestling sort of universe and certainly Bret Hart's own history, would he have had any incentive to repair that relationship? I mean, so much of it, I think, was Bret also at that time feeling like he was done being bitter and living in bitterness and wanting to just simply focus on his, reminding the world about the good of the relationship, perhaps, and who's to say that at that time that was wrong of him to do? It's his own personal thing. But this is now clearly a point where he is drawing a line about, well, for one thing, we should also note that, I mean, Bret at this point, I don't know if he stands to gain that much with a relationship with the WWE. So I think that might at least have a part in perhaps him feeling so vocal, feeling so kind of free to be vocal about this. But this is also Bret who, even when he was actually, isn't he on a Legends contract still?
Yes.
Or is he not?
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, even at that, like, Bret is never one to kind of hold back his words. And clearly everything that's come out right now with Janelle Grant has made him completely reassess what sort of human being Vince McMahon is. Throughout all of their interactions, I feel like there was probably a level of respect from Bret towards Vince as a businessman, as I don't know, just maybe even on some level a creative in the professional wrestling industry. But knowing some of these details, and clearly from Bret's perspective, fully believing in a lot of these details and believing in the evidence presented in this lawsuit, they are enough for him to completely change his mind about his level of respect for Vince McMahon. And I'm, for one, like happy to hear somebody who's as respected in the industry as Bret Hart come out to say these things. I also have to ask, like, how many people internally that are currently working for the WWE that still have a lot invested in, I think, their words, you know, and any words that might actually make the company look bad. How many want to have these words said, want to say the same things that Bret is saying right now, but can't?
There's probably a lot. Even if you look at just Vince McMahon as being, I mean, there's an aspect to it that I think that there are still those that would be nervous to, like, this has been the ultimate power broker in professional wrestling for so long. And as much as this feels like the true end of the Vince McMahon career, how many thought that 2 years ago? Like, these are professional wrestlers as well. That, I mean, could this guy end up back in power? And am I going to be outspoken now? I'm sure that is a calculus that some of them still have, and understanding that I'm still working for this person's son-in-law.
Yeah. This moment right now feels way worse, or at least like way more. It's way harder for me to think Vince could ever come back from what this moment feels like. However, we have still yet to hear publicly his defense of everything. And I just know that there are going to be people, like, look at, you know, some of our Instagram comments. There are going to be enough people that will latch on to the slightest bit of, you know, excuse that Vince will be presenting to be able to say this is enough. Vince is forgiven. And I mean, I kind of dread that moment, but at the same time, I mean, his defense deserves to be heard. It deserves to be listened to, you know, just even in the court of public opinion. Do you think we will, or we're any closer to getting that, or is that something that they might just basically wait to even not potentially reveal if this goes to a settlement?
Well, I think that regardless of if the civil suit is settled or not, there is the potential of an indictment. And I think that's going to have the greater focus of, you know, Vince McMahon having to defend himself, not having the option of reaching a settlement, which the Janelle Grant case, it might not. It's too hard to predict how a case like that will end. But the potential of criminal charges coming his way. I mean, that, you know, he gets his right to a defense like any other person that is accused of a crime. And I think that he's due that process, but there is just so much that every day we are getting more and more. And I think that's going to embolden others that will come forward over time. Like, we are getting a different kind of an autopsy on the WWE and the person that led this entire culture.
And it's a total reflection on all of us, about, I think, maybe the lack of attention we all paid to these types of allegations that were, at least in the sphere in the past, people, you know, cases like Rita Chatterton's or Ashley Massaro's, you know, I just kind of, I'm thinking back to Karen Peterson's words, you know, from post pro res. A lot of these things were out there, and for whatever reason, they were either refuted or flat out just basically kind of, you know, denounced by people like Bret Hart, and or not just simply not paid attention, not taken as seriously. Hopefully that's different now.